So, what happens to my foster kids is because trauma causes them to have a very quick trigger. And what I mean is, trauma has a physical effect on our brain. And what happens is we end up being frozen in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so, when a child, especially the child who tends to be a fighter, those fight kids tend to get a bad reputation because they're so easily triggered. They go into that fight mode, which is their survival brain. They don't have control over it. It is a trauma response. And the teachers have too big of a class. They don't have any instructional aids, and they don't really understand trauma.
Hello, hello, and welcome to Keyboard. I am Thembi, soft as a whisper, or Tembi, sharp as a drum. I'm a theater artist, educator, and tech enthusiast who loves to talk to interesting people about their journeys in arts, education, and technology. And I'm your host. Today's guest is Sharon Dunlevy, an educational advocate for children in foster care. Her primary work includes training foster parents on the educational laws that affect children in foster care and how to use those laws to ensure that these children graduate successfully. In our conversation, Sharon tells us about her work in special education, ministry, and advocacy for children in foster care. We cover the deep need for compassion in this work, setting boundaries, and the real cost of failing to support our most vulnerable young people. And we talk about the hope that still exists in the kids, in their caregivers, and in the community members who keep showing up to fill the gap. Sharon Dunlevy is next. Welcome, Sharon Dunlevy. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to have you here with us today.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Let's jump in. So walk us through your journey to educational advocacy. How'd you end up doing this work?
Yes. I've always wanted to work with children ever since I was in like high school. And I was trained as a teacher, special education specifically. And I actually took a little detour and was a children's minister for 20 years. I felt the call to ministry and pursued that. And then I wanted to get back to serving more vulnerable children and actually wanted to start a special needs ministry in my church, and they weren't very excited about it. So
Hmm.
I decided to, yeah, unfortunately, that happens a lot. So I decided to leave the church and go out into the secular world and be in ministry there to vulnerable children. So I jumped around to some different jobs, and because of my education or my special education background, a job that came open was for an educational advocate for children in foster care at a licensing agency here in Indianapolis. And I just jumped on it. It just seemed like the perfect fit for what I had done and my desire to serve those types of children. And so I applied and got the job. I did that under a grant for 3 years, and then the grant ran out and COVID hit all at the same time. And so I kind of just
Wow.
started my own business. And so
Mm-hmm.
now what I do is I offer training classes for foster parents specifically around educational advocacy. So I'm training the foster parents to be educational advocates for the children in their homes.
Wow. Okay. I want to back up a little bit. You said that you had trouble getting a ministry started for children in foster care with your church. Do you feel like there were people in the church, or is that just an area that the church felt like that's not really what we focus on? See if you can find something else.
Well, so what it was, and it was really just for special needs kids in general. I had a few that were in Sunday school and they were looking for a place to meet and have people work with them and just kind of be there for them. And I wanted to start this and become a focus. And the pastor at the time and some of the other church leaders were really into this building project. And that just, they felt like that was going to take away from the building project. So I just kind of moved on. It wasn't,
Okay.
yeah, it
Gotcha.
wasn't the right space. And unfortunately, in terms of churches with children in foster care, I have heard this over and over and over again that foster parents need safe places to do things like exchange for visitations with, the bio families, or to just go someplace and get support from other foster parents. And part of the issue that they had with my church and what I'm hearing in other churches is who's going to watch the kids while the parents are meeting. And
Okay.
there's some discomfort around that, right? Children with special needs, children like foster kids who have trauma, they have special needs, and you have to have the
Yeah.
right people there. And that just becomes an issue. However, if you are listening and you have a church that's looking for a way to reach out into the community, this is what's needed, right? They need open doors. They need a place where you don't necessarily have to lead the group. They just want a safe place that they can meet, and then maybe have childcare if that's a possibility. So
So the idea is that the place needs to be neutral and it needs to have staff there who have some trauma informed care training or some training with
yes,
special needs
at
children.
least some training.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I
Yeah, and it
I was
is.
gonna say I can imagine how if you are a leader of a church or any other organization that could potentially offer that space, if you don't feel like you're qualified or you don't feel like you have the staff, you're worried about liability. Did you get a lot of liability concerns with that?
Yes, exactly. A lot of liability concerns. So that's where, be creative, think outside the box, see if you can partner with a licensing agency near you. They could probably send staff to help look out for the kids. But that neutral, safe location is really important.
I love that you decided to just move on and figure it out in a different way. That's really important, and I'm
Yeah.
glad that you found another opportunity.
Ministry doesn't have to happen in a church building, right? And actually,
Yeah,
most
yeah.
ministry happens outside of that church building. And so, I
Mm,
still see myself as in ministry. I'm still a minister for God. I just do it a different way.
I love that. And so, was there a specific event or experience that shaped your approach to working with children, or you said you had always wanted to work with them since you were in high school? Was there something that happened, or something you saw, someone who was close to you?
Yes. So when I was in high school, my parents are both scientists. My sister was pretty strong in science, and I thought I wanted to be a scientist too, specifically working with animals. So I took biology and child development the same year, my 10th grade year, and really hated biology. Absolutely hated it, but loved child development. My teacher, I remember her first name was Janet. I should remember her last name, but I don't. But we ran a preschool in our high school. And so what we did was, like, for a month or two, we just learned about child development, learned about all of the theories around child development, Piaget, Erickson, all of these things. And I just fell in love with this. And then we ran the preschool itself in our high school, and just that was it. Those kids were my heart. I just loved those children. So I did that for 10th grade, 11th grade, and my senior year, as well as working in a daycare center in the summers. And so when I went to high school or college, I obviously went as a for to learn how to be a teacher. And I went to Syracuse University because at that time they were one of the very first schools to start integrating special needs children in with their peers. In the past, special needs children were always in either their own school, their own classroom, and Syracuse had a professor who pioneered this program where we did inclusivity, and we actually went out into the Syracuse schools and were working with this inclusivity model that they were following as partner with our college. So that's really where it came from, is from high school and then on.
Wow. So in high school, you had an opportunity not only to learn the theory, but the practice of the work to have know that you wanted to do it rather than, like you said, what did you say? You didn't like biology? Was what you talking?
Exactly.
Yeah. You took that. No, thank you. But you were able to
Yes.
have some practical experience with the children. That's
I
wonderful.
didn't like biology. Yep. Yeah, all that genus and species, and I just know that was not me.
So okay, so you moved on to learn education, and so you you found at Syracuse that this program was beginning to integrate children with special needs with general ed classrooms. And
Yes.
this was your preference. Does it remain your preference? Do you feel like there's something that should be adjusted, or that's the way to go?
That's the way to go. And what we have learned, and we still continue to learn, is that children with special needs always learn better when they're integrated with their non-special needs peers, however you want to say that. We also know that the children in the general population learn better when they have to learn with special needs peers in the room. And that's because they learn from each other. It's not about always learning from the teacher, right? How much of learning comes from collaborating with each other, doing projects together. And the other thing is, and especially right now, where we have a kind of a thing about empathy and compassion, right? We've got
Yes.
some issues around empathy and compassion is weak and all of this. It's not. We need to be more empathetic. We need to be more compassionate. Our society has grown so individualistic that we don't even know what we're talking about. When we have integrated classrooms, we learn empathy and compassion because we're walking side by side with each other. And if we separate them, it's easy to be other, right? It's easy to depersonalize the person. I mean, we went through this in the 60s with African Americans integrating into white schools. Same concept. We learn better in integration, and it just goes across the board.
Yeah, and separate but unequal is a real thing, right? I would assume
Exactly.
that the special needs classes had less resources, fewer resources
In
rather, right? And so
2025,
same concept, they're not
yeah,
learning, they're not getting what they deserve and what they're entitled
exactly.
to as students.
Right. And somebody with a mild disability would be
Hmm.
put in with somebody with a severe disability.
Right. I remember
And
that
that,
as a child. I remember
yes.
seeing that. Yeah, the whole
And then
range.
they
It was
want
just in one
And then they
area.
wondered why all of the kids acted up. Well, it's the
Mm.
same thing with foster care. When you have a child with very severe trauma, they're
Hmm.
given what's called a CAN score, which is basically CAN scores measure how much trauma is affecting their behaviors. So a 1 or 2 are very low, like it's not affecting their behaviors much. 3 and 4, it's affecting their behaviors some, and then 5 and 6 and over are it's really affecting their behaviors. Well, what happens is these 5 and 6s and plus get put into a residential facility. Well, so you've put all these kids with these really high behavioral issues all together, and
Hmm.
what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Do they get any better? No.
No. Right.
They feed off of each other. I've had kids come out of residential, and the residential center will say how scary they are, how angry they are, how uncontrollable they are. But once they get out of that place, they're not like that because they're no longer being affected. I mean, I had one child that I worked with, one teen I worked with, and he talked about hoarding food in the ceiling tiles because there was no privacy in these places, you
Oh my
know? I
gosh.
mean, so I mean, of course he came out and they had this horrible description of him, and his foster parents and I were like, we don't know what kid you're talking about, but that's not the kid we know. And
Wow.
so yeah, anytime we can break down those barriers, we're going to just make things better for our children.
Hmm.
And they're going to grow up with a better sense of community and a sense of compassion, empathy, what it means to be a society that works together rather than separately.
We need that for sure.
Yeah.
You talked about the integration of special needs children inside of general education classrooms.
Hmm.
And I think, I wonder what are some of the disconnects that we might have when it comes to effectively educating children, special needs children, as well as children in foster care in those populations. You talked about being there's a range of behavioral issues that result from trauma, right? And so
Hmm.
putting everybody together in one space without taking into consideration their level of trauma clearly affects them poorly. What are other issues that we're not noticing?
So we tend to be a society also that labels, right? So
Hmm.
what happens to my foster kids is because trauma causes them to have a very quick trigger. And what I mean is because trauma has a physical effect on our brain. And what happens is we end up being frozen in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so when a child, especially the child who tends to be a fighter, I am a fighter. Like that's my thing. If something's coming at me, I'm the one that's going to be coming back at it. And so those fight kids tend to get a bad reputation because they're so easily triggered. They go into that fight mode, which is their survival brain. They don't have control over it. It is a trauma response. And the teachers have too big of a class. They don't have any instructional aids, and they don't really understand trauma. They just don't. They haven't been trained. We need to be doing better jobs teaching our school staff what trauma means and how it presents. And so they think traditional discipline is going to work. Well, what happens when you have a kid who's already triggered and then you tell them to go to the principal's office in front of the entire class? You've just added another layer of trauma on top of them. Now they are not only triggered, they're being singled out and they're being sent away, which is always an issue. Inclusion is always better for trauma. It's better if you can sit with them, have them be where you are and quiet, not sending them away. But that's something you have to learn over time. And they have to have the help in the classroom. I'm not going to criticize teachers. Our teachers do as much as they can in the system that they're in. The system is imperfect. It's not the teachers. But so what happens is we need to be better aware of what happens with our children with trauma, but we also need to not label them. And teachers do this and they don't really realize they do it. But they talk about kids with each other. And I don't know how many times, like even when I was in school, I was aware of this, that I was a military brat. So we all knew each other and all that. And used to be you'd go to the school and see what they would have the list of names on the door of what classroom you're going to be in. And they would purposely separate certain kids, right? Because they had this reputation and all of this. Well, what happens with children who have labels like special needs, like foster care, teachers know that. And they don't mean to do it, but as soon as they hear a kid is in foster care, they automatically assume they're going to have behavior problems. And it almost becomes like the foster care student is the one to blame rather than that they're a victim of what happened to them. And so there tends to be this sense of, oh, so and so's in foster care. Well, I'm going to really have to watch out for him. And then when you hyper focus like that, you're going to see the bad behaviors, right? I mean, if we're looking for it, we're going to see it. And that it just builds on each other. It's kind of like when my daughter was in kindergarten. Her teacher had a really bad habit, and I would volunteer all the time. And her teacher would always have this bad habit of saying, well, of course the boys aren't going to line up quietly because they never do.
Oh,
Well,
wow.
guess what happened in her classroom every single day?
The boys wouldn't
Every
line up
single day
quietly.
is
Yeah.
right. Why should they? She
Right.
already assumed they weren't going to. This is what happens. And then the foster kids feel like, well, I've already been labeled. The teacher doesn't really want to know who I am. And so then they build a barrier. They don't want to. It's hard enough for them to trust an adult because the adults are usually the reason why they're in foster care in the first place. It wasn't something this kid did, it's something an adult did to them.
Right.
And so they already don't trust adults. And then you've got adults who are labeling them, who are looking for the worst rather than the best. And they're going to act out. And it's just this cycle that goes on and on and on. So yeah, it's really hard for foster kids to feel comfortable in school.
You mentioned trauma and the way that teachers, when they encounter information about students, can develop this sort of unconscious bias, right, against children, what they expect even
Hmm.
before they meet the children. Can
Yes.
you talk a little bit more about what is trauma informed care and how can that factor into the education of students?
Yeah, and let me start a little bit about explaining what I mean by trauma, because I think that starts the issue. Trauma is not an event. We all can have experiences that could be traumatic, but that's not what trauma is. Trauma is what is the response that happens in each individual person. So let me give you an example. Let's say you had a bad car accident and it's shaken you, all of this. And then so the car goes, it gets fixed, or you get the new car and it's time for you to drive again. Most people are going to get back in their car. They might think a little bit about, oh, yeah, I need to look a little better or whatever, but they're still going to get back in that car and drive. That is, so even though they experienced a traumatic event, they're not necessarily having a trauma response. Some people are going to get back in that car and they are going to be what's called hyper vigilant, right? They're going to be holding onto the wheel. Their knuckles are white. Their jaw is clenched. They're looking everywhere and they're ready to fight. Everybody's a bad driver. They may be cussing. Like I always joked, I never heard my dad cuss unless he was driving a car. I mean, it's, so they're cussing and they're looking for that trouble. Okay. So that is that fight trauma response. Let's say you getting ready to drive and you're like, you know what? I don't need to do that grocery shopping today. Maybe I'll just do it tomorrow. Maybe I'll just put it off. Or, and so that's a flight response, right? Making excuses on why you're not going to get back into car. Oh, I'm still kind of recovering. And so that's a flight response. The freeze response may be you get back into car, you turn the gas on, and then all of a sudden you just sit there and you can't do anything. And that's that freeze response. So everybody has different ways that they handle trauma. It doesn't mean somebody is weak. It doesn't mean anything like that. It just means their body genetically is different and everybody can experience the same event and have a very different response. And that is not controlled by them because there's two parts of the brain. There's the survival part of the brain back here and the thinking part of the brain up here. When we have a trauma response, we live in that survival brain back here. That's all that is functioning. This part of the brain is turned off. And that's what happens with children. So imagine as an adult how hard that car accident could be. But you're a child and you've had some type of traumatic experience and you already don't really understand and you're afraid. You're afraid it's going to happen again. You're afraid that you're going to get hurt again. You're afraid that you're going to get left again. Whatever that experience is, it's part of your present reality, even though it happened in the past, because this part of the brain cannot determine time. So, so when you think about that, I mean, it's just like a little kid when you tell them we're going to go to Disney World in a month and they ask you every day, has it been a month yet? That's the part of the brain you're living in. And so you don't know time, you don't know all of that. So when you go into a situation like the schools or anything like that, it's important to understand that these kids are not thinking, they're just acting. Their brain is just in survival mode and they are doing what their brain is telling them to do to survive. And that could be fighting back. It could be hiding in the corner and hiding their head. It could be yelling and screaming. It could be fleeing from the room. We have a lot of kids in foster care who tend to call what's eloping. They run away. And again, that is a survival thing. It doesn't necessarily mean anybody did anything wrong. It just means they were triggered. And it could be that they just, never interact with anybody around them because they're keeping that barrier up. They're keeping themselves safe. And so it's just really important for what I always say is it's really important for teachers and foster parents to be talking to each other and working together on identifying those trauma triggers and then working together on what works to overcome these trauma triggers. The foster parents are going to know some things that work, and the teachers might recognize some other things that work. But if they're in constant communication, then it's a better chance of, oh, yeah, so I noticed Johnny got triggered today because we had to cut our recess short. I mean, that can be a real traumatic event for some kids, right? They love the only thing they like about school is recess, and they've lost recess. Or they get triggered because they can't even do recess because it's raining outside. And so, and then the teacher says, but I was able to distract him by doing X, Y, and Z. Share that with the parent, and so then if you communicate all of these things, the other thing I tell foster parents to do is keep a journal. Anytime you've got a foster kid in your home, write these things down, because it's really important to go to the therapist, to go to the doctor. One of the things, I said my background is in special education. There is a lot of overlap with trauma also, and developmental disabilities, because trauma actually physically affects how the brain grows. Children with trauma often do have some learning delays. They might have a developmental disability, and trauma can mimic ADHD and autism. So you'll have to kind of be aware of where those differences are. And ADHD and autism medication will not work on trauma. It doesn't have the same effect. And so it's not a simple thing of just medicating a kid. It is, you really have to understand. And so anything that we can do to just kind of keep that dialogue open really helps. And that's kind of where I came in at the agency, where I was the educational advocate. I was kind of that go-between to kind of facilitate those conversations and making sure that the foster parents and the schools were talking with each other, and that the kid was getting the best help that they could.
As far as from the kids' perspective, how helpful is it to engage with them with regards to their trauma response? And how reliable can that information be if, as you say, they're still in flight or fight mode in back of their brain, whereas they're not in their thinking mode where they can have a conversation about, well, this is how I felt at that time and this is what was happening, and you know
Hmm. So what happens with, and I am not a therapist, but I've worked with enough therapists that I know what happens in therapy for children with trauma is, one, we're always told you never talk to the kid about what's happening while they're triggered. You have to allow them to de-escalate. And we teach foster parents de-escalation routines. There's a big movement on teaching teachers de-escalation tactics as well. Once the kid de-escalates, depending on their age, you can start having those conversations. Part of what needs to happen for kids with trauma is what's called co-regulation. You want to work with them for them to start seeing the triggers themselves. So, like, we recognize the triggers, but how do we have a conversation with them so that they recognize the triggers? And some of that is talking about, well, let's talk about what happened. What did Johnny do to make you, hit him across the face? It happens, right?
yeah, yeah.
So you have that conversation around, you know, do you remember what happened? And then if they can't, they can't. You can't push it, right? You just have to have that conversation, but you have that conversation over and over and over again.
Mhm.
Helping a child learn how to self-regulate doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of therapy, it takes a lot of talk, it takes a lot of support, and it takes the right relationships. So I have found that kids in foster care will tend to find one adult that they really bond with. And that is the person they trust, and that's the person they open up with. And sometimes it's not the foster parent, and that's hard for foster parents. And we always have to have these conversations of, it's really important for kids, and it's important for any child, to have non-parental adults that are interested in their welfare and helping them to grow. Because we know we don't tell our parents everything, right?
Right.
And And it's sometimes it is more comfortable to tell a non-parental adult. And so we have to kind of separate ourselves, not take it personally, not, look at it as a bad thing, but look at it as at least they have someone that they can talk to. And so another thing I tell my foster parents is make sure you're introducing kids to potential mentors. Get them involved in the community, get them involved in sports, music, art, whatever they like. When I was growing up, it was my singing teacher that was kind of my safe person, and that was hard for my mom. My mom really struggled with that relationship, but it was an important relationship for me to have. And then my own kid has some people where I told you the church that I worked with, my kid still goes to that church as a 23-year-old, does volunteer work, all that. And ladies that worked with me in Sunday school are now Scouts support. And I love it. I love it. I love that Scout feels safe and protected in that environment. And so that's really, really important is getting our kids to have those mentors, somebody is safe, somebody that they can talk with and open up with and really start to work through some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you may want to address the issue a day later. Now, if they're too young, they won't remember. They'll forget that they had even blown up, but older kids, you can start saying, hey, I noticed that you blew up yesterday, and can you tell me what happened? And the other thing to notice, and I tell foster parents this kind of goes back to when you look for bad things, you see bad things. I always tell my foster parents, look for the good things. So instead of focusing on when Johnny blew up at somebody, focus on when Johnny didn't blow up on somebody. Hey, so and so got in your face and I saw you walk away. That is fantastic. Tell me what went through your head that caused you to be able to step back and say, I'm not going to hit him today and walk away. So really focus not just on the bad, but like when they do well, focus on that. And that helps them understand that self regulation. Oh, yeah, I can make the decision not to act out and hit. I can make the decision to walk away. And that way we're positively affirming what they've done rather than always picking on them for what they've done wrong.
It's interesting that you talk about positive affirmation and you include not only, hey, I noticed that you did this thing, but you're also suggesting that you ask the child to walk you through their thought process, which is interesting. That really adds a layer because it sounds like what you're saying is it's not enough just to say good job, that it makes
No.
yeah, that it makes a difference, right? To have them,
Yes.
okay, walk me through it. Tell me what
Yes.
you were thinking and how you made your decision.
Yeah, it's again, we've kind of pulled away from this, but it's called executive functioning. And if you ever ask employers, what are they looking for in an employee? They want somebody with high executive functioning skills. They want somebody who can take a responsibility when they make a mistake. They want somebody who is going to manage their time well. They're going to want somebody who can critically think through a process and all of those types of things. Well, that's what we need to teach our kids. And even though executive functioning doesn't fully develop until like the age of 25, we start building those executive functioning skills as babies. And so anytime we can be walking them through and having them think through why they act the way they do, we're building those executive functioning skills. And then the likelihood that that kid will succeed as an adult becomes greater because we've taught them to think about their actions and not just always live in our lower brain, right? We've got to build this brain. It's a muscle and we have to work to build it. And unfortunately, I bet we can all name a few adults that don't have executive functioning skills,
Yes, we
right?
can. Yes, we
Yeah,
can.
because they weren't taught to look at life that way. And so that's kind of our biggest responsibility, in my opinion, as parents is helping our kids build those skills and think through all of our actions. And let's be honest, I'm 52 years old and I still have a trigger temper sometimes, right? Even my own executive functioning fails me at times. And it is so it's something you have to constantly work on. We have to constantly build, but we can build it by having those conversations. I'm all for just, kids need people to talk with. And if they know you're going to be a non judgmental adult and just listen and not talk, goes a long way in building that relationship between you and the kid.
It definitely seems like when children believe and see evidence that adults actually value what they have to say and what they're thinking, they tend to open up. So that's really important. I'm glad that you pointed that out. And you talked about how classroom teachers can support the students in their care. But what about the school administrators and the school systems? Are there things that are structural that they can put in place that can support students in foster care?
Yeah. So some of the things is obviously the very first thing is addressing bullying. And I know a lot of schools are dealing with that, but I think schools are inconsistent sometimes with how they address bullying and how they look at it. Bullying has become a bigger problem than I think people want to credit it for. I think, again, it goes back to that sense of lack of compassion. How come people just can't be tough and they can't just take it? That's not really what we want people to be, right? Because if we're growing or telling everybody that just suck it up and be tough, we're going to have a whole generation of kids who have no empathy, no compassion, no sense of community. And we don't want that. So, we
Hmm.
need to address the bullying for sure. And we can do that in ways. I mean, we put signs up, no bullying and all that, but I don't know that kids always know what that they're being bullies. I don't think they always know that. And they're just acting out what they've seen or experienced. So it needs to be more than just talking about it. We need to be talking to the parents about what does bullying look like. We need to be again modeling as again as adults, one of our biggest roles is as models. I talk to the foster parents all the time about being careful what they say about bio families in where the kids can hear. Don't badmouth bio parents. Don't get on the phone and start talking about them to somebody who's a family member and has nothing to do with that kid, right? Like that's
Hmm.
just gossiping. So we need to be those models. The other thing is we need to be open in our schools to providing accommodations, even if a kid doesn't qualify for an individualized education plan under the Disabilities Act. Even if they don't qualify for a behavioral plan under the 504 Act, which is under Social Security, even if they don't qualify for those things, we still can provide accommodations. My daughter never we think that they're on the autism scale, if not also ADHD. Never could get a diagnosis ever. And but I was savvy enough because of my background, I just worked with their teachers. And we would always just put things in place. So we used to have these writing assignments. It would be called a night write. And anytime a night write came home, Scout would be in tears and just upset because they could never think about what they needed to write. The pressure was too much. I just worked with the teachers and said, okay, this is too much. Can my kid have a week to do this night write? And that would work usually. I mean, I had a couple of teachers that would push back. For the most part, though, they don't want our kids to fail. They just don't know that that doesn't work for every kid. Um, so things like that. The other thing that we can do is, and again, it's going to be really hard in this culture right now when DEI and all of these things are bad words, but we tend to talk as if every child grows up with a mom and a dad and grandparents that they know or live nearby. So, like our schools here have Grandparents' Day. Well, my parents live all the way on the East Coast, and I'm in Indianapolis. My husband's parents lived a little closer, but they were still in Ohio. So we had surrogate grandparents from our church that would come and do all the grandparents' day stuff with Scout. That's great. I had resources. A foster kid doesn't necessarily have that. So, if you do have a foster kid in your house, in your home, or in your class, being careful about talking about moms and dads and grandparents and what does that mean? And instead of singling out a kid saying, oh, well, for you, finding ways around that. So there were activities that our school would do, like pumpkin carving with dad. And if dad wasn't available, they would let another adult join them. And so just making sure that our kids aren't being singled out, they're not being made to feel bad, all of those things. The other thing is the competitiveness that happens in schools around. Sometimes they use competition in order to motivate, and that's fine, again, if everybody's on the same playing level. But for example, again, we had these stupid night rides, but we also had these math tests. They would do these, I forget what they called them, but it would just be kind of like a pop quiz type thing, and you'd have to solve 100 math problems all at once. And again, my kid, overwhelmed, couldn't do it, figured out that if we cut the page with just 2 lines of problems at a time, then they could do it. But they wanted to skip all over the page and they would never get it done. But the worst part was, as you walked into the classroom, there was a chart with everybody's name and on which math test they had passed already. And so some kids would be all the way over here and my kid would be down here, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
that's going to negatively
that's
affect your child's
right.
self
We
perception.
think, yeah, we think the competition is going to spur them,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not on a level playing field.
Right.
And so then it just ends up making people feel bad. So we've really got to think through some of that idea that competition is going to create motivation, because it's not. What happens then is kids like mine, my sister went through this as well. If they feel like they can't keep up, what do?
Act
They
out.
give up,
Oh, well, yeah. Give up.
or they
Yeah.
or they act
Mm-hmm.
out.
Give
Yeah,
up, act
maybe.
out, fight
Or
or flight, right? That's
what
what
we
you said.
found,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, Scout started getting stomach aches. And
Oh,
it took us a whole semester to put together that every time Scout had a stomach ache, they had a math test.
ah,
It took us a while to put that together. And
oh.
I know what I'm doing.
So you think of folks who are foster parents and or just children in whatever situation. If they don't have the resources, they don't have
Hmm.
parents who are educators, or maybe the parent works at night. Who knows?
Yeah.
You don't have that visibility and to say, hold on, I'm noticing a pattern. Let me see if I can do something about that.
Exactly. And so once we talked to Scout about this and that, we did not expect them to have to pass this every time, the stomach ache started to go away. So yeah, we have to think all of these things through, and it's a lot. I understand that, but school should be a safe place. That should be a safe place, that every kid should be able to feel good about going to school.
Hmm.
Even if they're not great learners, they still should feel good about going to school. And something that I would love to see gone, but this is high above everything, is these state tests.
Oh
You
goodness,
know,
yeah.
the high stake tests that not only affect the kids' abilities to progress grade to grade. I mean, teachers' raises are often
Yep.
dependent on state testing.
Hmm.
School funding becomes dependent on state testing. I mean, it's stupid. It's so much pressure on everybody. And let's be real, what our kids are learning based off of the state tests is nothing like what we used to learn when we were going through
Yeah.
school and we did projects and we did team work and we had fun while we were learning. Now, as much as I hated biology, I actually liked chemistry because we did
Hmm.
all of the experiments.
Experiments, yeah.
Well,
Hmm.
how much of that do they do anymore? Like, I know Scout went through
It's
school.
teaching to the test,
Yeah,
right? It's about teaching to the
yeah,
test. We're preparing for a test. Let's work on that. Let's not
yeah.
get you excited about learning and wanting to learn. And sort of like what you talked about with your experience, experimenting with different things and figuring out what you like. what you want to learn more of.
Yes. And that all builds this frontal brain because you have to plan out a project. A project is not just regurgitating something that you've learned, it is actually creating. And creating is part of executive functioning. So yeah, it's a big problem, but there are just those little things that we can do. We can address the bullying in a positive, in a way that makes an effect, bringing in parents to talk about bullying, not just the kids, um, being very hyper vigilant about seeing any type of bullying happening, and then having a conversation with the bully as well as the one who was bullied on how to handle that type of thing. Here in the school system that my child was in, we actually had a program that we identified some kids that were what we called potential bullies, and we had them go through a leadership program at a equine therapy stable. They worked with horses and learned how to be positive leaders rather than bullies. And
Mm,
because bullies do tend to have those leadership qualities, they just need
yes,
to be fine tuned, right?
absolutely. They're often very good at getting folks to follow them and
Yeah,
getting folks to
yeah,
mobilizing other students. So
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
for
when I was
sure.
growing up, it was called bossiness.
Yes.
And I would
So
just now yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, I was going to say, so it sounds like you're painting an ideal picture of a school, that this school has mechanisms in place to mitigate bullying, to support all students in learning regardless of what their background is. It sounds very universal and anti singling students out for their situation. Would that be an accurate depiction of what you're painting for us?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I always said that, special needs kids get an individualized education plan. Reality is every child should have an individualized education plan because whether or not
Mm,
they have a learning disability, we all have areas that we're strong in and we all have areas we're weak in.
yeah.
And and we should be celebrating, and some of those couldn't be non-academic subjects too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we've gotten away from the ones wanting to pull all the music and arts and stuff out of school. I think they've started to learn that that's not a good
It's a
idea,
terrible
but
idea.
yeah, right?
It's
And
terrible.
and a lot of that came from the employers who looked back and said, "No, no, 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 don't pull that from the schools because the good employees that I have are creative, right? And so
Yeah.
they're the ones that have, if they do music on the side or art on the side. This is an employee I want." And what really kind of brought it home for them was a lot of the when we would talk about the Asian countries, we really were looking. They were constantly wanting to hire these people from India and other Asian countries that were very academic. But what the employers found was they didn't have creative thinking. If something didn't go exactly the way it was supposed to, they didn't know how to pivot and think creatively about a different approach. And so they really protested going to this purely academic model in the US because they recognized that that creative piece was so important for what they wanted in an employee. So you're going to have kids who maybe are horrible at math and English and all of that, but man, are they a superstar in band or in art class? And those should be seen as important as the others. Or how do you maybe incorporate math and English into music class or any of those things? We hosted 5 foreign exchange students while our kid was in high school. And one of the things they do in Europe is they don't necessarily separate out all the subjects like we do. They're much more integrated. So you're learning about science as you're learning about English. You're learning about math as you're applying it to chemistry or something like that. They don't do these separate subjects as much as we do. And then there's a much more holistic view of what education is. And that helps support, like you said, we want schools to be supportive for all students, regardless of their abilities, regardless of anything. And that's a way to do it, is really looking at those positives and building on those strengths, and not always pushing people towards college or things like that.
Absolutely. So, how do you manage the emotional weight of this very taxing work?
It's just like I was saying, I have to have creative outlets,
Okay,
right? I
okay, that
mean,
makes
that
sense.
I have to have creative outlets. So I do crafts. My husband and I do a lot of what we call our little adventures, and we'll just take a weekend and go someplace new.
Oh, I love that.
Um,
That's great.
yeah, we do. We like to travel. We like to try new things. And so we will. We'll just one weekend we'll just go do something new, or we'll go see a play. We're not big movie people, but we love live theater, so we'll go and do
Hmm.
that. So but we're very purposeful. And even when Scout
Hmm.
was growing up and our my parents weren't around, I told you we had those surrogate grandparents. We did date nights all the time. And it was really important for us to spend that time together. And we've been married now, it'll be 27 years next month.
Oh,
And
congratulations. Happy
yeah,
anniversary.
yeah, and but he's been my rock, and we rely on each other and we work well together. And I know that's not true with everybody's marriage, but you have to have things outside of work. You just have to.
Hmm.
And you have to protect yourself. It is hard. I mean, there have been kids that I would want to bend over backwards for and just do everything for. And it breaks my heart when I can't, but I also have to know I can't. I have one former foster kid that every so often she messages me on Facebook. And as soon as she messages me, I know she's going to tell me some woeful story about needing money. And I tell her every single time, I wish I could help, but I can't. And I can't do
Hmm.
that, right?
Can't cross that
It
boundary.
can't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And boundaries, that
Yeah.
is a huge thing. If you're going to keep yourself,
Hmm.
keep that emotional weight off of you, then yeah, you have to have good boundaries. The other thing I do is I try and find just, little things. My husband and I, we love to laugh at stuff, and it's just goofy stuff. We have kind of a sick sense of humor. But, we have a dog. We used to have two dogs, but our dogs just do funny things, and we just make, laugh at it, and all of that. And then I also have an accountability group, a group of ladies that I meet with once a week. And that is really, really important too. And we meet via Zoom because we all live around the country. We don't live near each other, but we meet via Zoom, but we meet once a week and we hold each other accountable. We have books that we read together, and we just support each other. And I think that's really important. And that's where I was at the very beginning when we were talking about churches. That's kind of that thing that I was talking about is we've a lot of times I think foster parents or parents of children with disabilities feel isolated. And so any way that some type of community can be built for them to come together and feel connected with each other. And I do that. I have a Facebook group for my foster parents, and I meet with them once a month, doing just a kind of a quick class, but a lot of it is just being together so that they're not alone, and feeling like that.
That's beautiful. And clearly, you and your husband are fans of literature. Your child's
Yeah.
name is Scout, right? So that's got to
Hmm.
be properly, right?
Actually, Scout chose their own names. They were born
Oh,
Rachel, but Scout chose their
ah.
own name.
So
But they
Scout
did
is a literature buff.
also,
Okay.
because
Got it.
yes,
Got it.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a major reader, and it broke my heart when Scout was little and didn't want to read. But yeah, no, Scout's not only is Scout a reader, is a writer. Uh, yeah.
Well, good on them. Good on them.
Hmm.
And I love the way that you prioritize self-care.
Yes.
Very often, the people who are really great at this work will run themselves into the ground and will have to
Hmm.
step back from it. And you can't pour from an empty cup.
Hmm.
So it's really great to hear.
No, I learned a hard lesson in college. I got mono. I got mono in college. I used to stay up late writing papers. I used to want to have an A in every class. My junior year of college, I got mono. And from then, my life changed. I could not do what I used to do. I actually technically have fibromyalgia. And I have told people that I really believe that God gave me fibromyalgia because otherwise I would have had a heart attack by the age of 50
Mm,
because I was so driven and I didn't have those boundaries. Everything was my problem. Everything had to be solved by me. All of my friends would come to me for solutions.
wow.
And as I was going through 20 years of trying to figure out what it was that I had and all the diagnosis and all the tests and stuff, I went through those periods where I felt like, why? But it finally came to me that this was part of God saying, you cannot do it all. And so, yeah, and I know I'm pushing my boundaries if all of a sudden, like you said, I'm run down, I'm sick, I'm in bed, and my body just very clearly tells me, "You've done too much, step back," and so I've learned to listen to those, and I've come to terms with my limitations. That took a lot because I am type A personality. I didn't want to come to terms with my limitations. I wanted to be able to do it all, but it's taken a long time, but I've come to terms with I can only do what I can do. And and that's and that's enough, right? It's enough.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
always is. It always is. And you know something interesting? I feel very strongly that a lot of these things, specifically what you do and what others do to address these gaps in the lives and the proper education of young people, these are systemic issues. These are
Yes.
issues that come from systemic problems that are on such a large
Yes.
scale that individual people
Mhm.
decide, you know what, I'm going to dedicate my career, life, work, however, whatever part of your life you
Mhm.
choose to dedicate to filling in a gap that is a systemic gap that I
Yes.
didn't create, but I
Right.
know is meaningful. And so there's there's something to be said for when you talk about knowing your limitations, knowing that I'm addressing something systemic that really needs to be addressed by the whole of us, but I'm
Mhm.
modeling, like you said earlier,
Mhm.
to others. What does it look like to
Yeah.
be a contributor to our society? What does it look like to say, yeah, I
Mhm.
didn't create a lot of these systemic issues, but I want to be a part of the solution. I want to create ways within my skill set to address the solution and make other people's lives better. And that's what I think is the most powerful thing about the work that you do, at least from my perspective. And so I want to ask you, what gives you hope about the future of this work? We have very obvious and clear systemic challenges facing us now.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
how are you hopeful? What are you hopeful about as we navigate through all these challenges?
So there's two things that I'm very helpful about. One is the kids. I have had I've had the privilege of speaking with a lot of former foster kids who have done incredible things with their life. I just had a conversation with one young man last week, and I did a podcast with another former foster kid a couple of weeks ago. They Instead of saying, "Oh my, I'm a victim," all of this, they're telling their stories. They're getting out there and they're trusting people enough to be vulnerable and say, "This is what happened to me, and this is what I'm doing to make sure it doesn't happen to others." The young man that I talked to last week, he is what's called a CASA, which is a court appointed special advocate, and he goes to court with foster kids to make sure that their rights are covered. And it's a volunteer position. It's not paid, and he loves it. And he was telling me stories about the kids he's worked with and all of this because he didn't have that when he was going through foster care. So he decided, "Oh, I didn't even know these existed." Somebody said, "Why don't you become a CASA?" And he's like, "I don't even know what that is." And then when he learned what it is, he's like, "Absolutely, because I know what these kids are going through." The one who's doing the podcast, she brings together all these former foster kids to tell their stories on what they're doing now and how they've overcome, or if they haven't overcome. So bringing some of that reality. The other thing that I find hope in is the foster parents. And I know there are bad foster parents out there. There are not as many as I think people, the media and some of that it makes it out to be. The ones that I work with, I mean, I teach classes for them and they show up like they want to know. They want to do better. They want to help their kids. They want to learn those processes that are going to make the kids successful as adults. And I take a lot of hope from that, because they're amazing people. And let me tell you, nobody is making money as a foster parent. I don't care what media says. They don't get paid enough to even barely cover the kids' eating, let alone anything else. And children, foster parents who take in preschoolers, they don't get extra to put those preschoolers into child care.
Oh, wow.
So they're paid the same amount.
Hmm.
Yeah, they're paid the same amount as a person who's fostering a school-age kid or a teenager. So, they're doing this because they really do want to make a difference. And regardless of what happens politically and all of this stuff, there's always going to be kids out there that are going to need foster parents, that are going to need adults who can look after them and help them overcome what's happened to them in their lives. And so that's where I take my hope from, as them.
Mm. And it sounds like they deserve our support because I think there
Hmm.
might be just kind of an unconscious assumption on all of our parts that if someone becomes a foster parent, like, okay, you got that. Good job. Congratulations.
Right.
Versus how can we help? How can we
Yeah.
support? How can we work together?
Yeah.
Maybe if I happen to have a young child, and you have a young child and yours is a foster child and mine isn't, or vice versa, how can we work
Hmm.
together in terms of parenting knowledge? And
Yeah.
it just feels like there needs to be more of a collective
Yeah.
connection
Yes.
with
And just
parenting.
getting breaks. I mean, nobody thinks about it, but
Yeah, yeah,
how tiring is it to work with a kid who's constantly triggered and yet they don't get breaks? If they can't, because they can't just leave, they can have somebody come in for the day, but if somebody's going to look after that child overnight, they usually have to be fingerprinted and approved by the state. I mean, it's not just like
right.
you can send them somewhere overnight. It's a big process. So how do
Hmm.
you get those breaks? So one of the things, if anybody's thinking like, oh, I don't want to be a full-time foster parent, you could be a respite foster parent. And
Oh,
all you would do is you would get licensed by the state to be a foster parent. You would get paid for the nights that you host a foster kid, but you would just be where they would send you the kids while mom and dad, or foster mom or foster dad, take a break and,
okay.
have a little bit of a time to breathe. So, there are ways to support without having to be an actual foster parent, because not everybody should be a foster parent.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I
right?
mean, Sharon, not everybody should be a parent. Let's just be
Right?
real out here. Okay.
Right.
We're having a real conversation. I feel like we all
Hmm.
know there's some people who are like, yeah, you probably could have sat that one out. You don't need
Yeah.
to be a parent. But here we
Exactly.
are, right? Again,
Right.
systemic. People feel pressured, feel like they have to. It's like, if you don't think you'd
Hmm.
be a good parent, just go ahead and don't do it. We're good.
Right. You don't need to be, we don't need
Mm-mm.
everybody to be a parent. No.
Mm-mm.
No, we're not populating farm hands and stuff like we used to,
Hello.
Big families were, that was the only way to survive, but yeah, it's
Right.
not the same now.
We're past
Yeah.
that. Oh,
Hmm.
wow. Well, Sharon, it's really been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I have learned
Thank you.
so much. Absolutely. I've learned so much about what you've said. I've loved listening to your explanations of these different aspects of the
Mm,
brain and trauma. And because it really, I think, helps me and, of course, our listeners think about this in a different way. And the more
yeah.
nuance we can add to this conversation, the better
Yeah.
I think people will feel stepping up to the plate in their own
Yeah.
communities, in their own families, in their own lives when it comes time to take care of our kids.
I hope so. I hope so. Because,
Yeah,
it's really about those kids always. It's just about those kids.
absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me on Key Bar today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it too.
Thank you. That's it for us today. Till next time. Keyboard is produced, directed, and hosted by Tembi Duncan. Theme music produced by Psycho Sid. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow, leave a review, or give us a 5-star rating. Your support helps the show reach more listeners, and it means the world to me. Thank you for listening.